Hello, everybody. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and dive in today to the joint webinar between Cybrary and MITRE Ingenuity called Bringing Attack Evaluations into Your Attack-Based SOC Assessments. I'm joined today by a great cast of characters from the MITRE Ingenuity team, who you'll hear from in a little bit as they do their parts of the discussion today. And I'm Will Carlson, the Director of Content here at Cybrary. I will say that I couldn't be more excited about the continued partnership between Cybrary and MITRE Ingenuity and all the offerings that that's brought to the catalog and to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the meat of the discussion today. And to do so, I'll be passing it off to Andy Applebaum. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Will. Hey, everybody. My name's Andy Applebaum, and I'm a researcher here at MITRE. I've done a lot of stuff. Caldera, attack. Really here, I'm going to be talking about attack-based SOC assessments. And to kick off what we're going to talk about, I love to show this chart, which is a heat map where it's the attack framework. It's a heat map showing with some very basic scheme that we like to use, showing potential gaps that you might have in coverage. And the idea is we've taken all the techniques in attack and we've broken it down based on what our confidence is that a given SOC might be able to detect each technique. And just dive in deeper, it's a very simple scheme where in white, we have things in low confidence that the SOC would be able to detect. In yellow, we have things that we have some confidence the SOC might be able to detect. And in green, we have things that we have high confidence that the SOC might be able to detect. And this is a very simple thing to show. It's one of my favorite use cases for attack because it really says, hey, you have all these things that are going on in your SOC, and here's one picture that tries to just bring it all together and help you, reorient your operations. But more specifically, a chart like this, it really helps do a lot of things. Number one, having a knowledge of your detection gaps, it allows you to communicate your capabilities with a common reference. You might have 20 tools you're running in the SOC, and then you can say, using this heat map, well, tool 1 provides my persistence strength, and tool 2 provides my collection strength. The other big thing is that understanding your detection gaps allows you to inform your tooling purchases for the biggest return on investment, really understanding how to change what you're doing to get the most bang for your buck. You can also use this heat map to identify data sources to help enhance your detection program, and building off that to develop analytics targeting the highest impact threats, really those gaps you might have that you think are most likely to be executed in your environment. So this heat map is great, and I love showing it, but one of the questions we get often is, well, how do I build it? And we've been working for a few years on kind of building this attack-based SOC assessment methodology. And here I'm showing the methodology from the MITRE Attack Defender program, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the webinar. But this methodology is fairly straightforward, where you frame an assessment with the SOC you're working with. You set a rubric for, hey, what do we actually mean by having a technique with coverage? Here in this example I gave on the previous slide, that's that chart with the white, the yellow, and the green. Then you analyze components and you interview staff. You dive in and, largely pen and paper, right? Hands off. You try to figure out, well, here's how tool A maps to the attack framework. Here's how tool B maps to it. And here's, how the analytics map to it. And then you talk with people and figure out, well, on paper, tool A should be doing this, but in practice, it's doing this other thing. Doing all that, you then compile the results into that one single heat map. And then you also propose changes, give recommendations to the SOC to kind of enhance their overall posture. Now, I'm not going to dive into too deeply on what the overall methodology is and what it looks like. The course material we have for MAD really does a great job of that. But for this webinar, we're going to kind of go through an example of a SOC, completely fictional, that we're calling New Path. It's an organization that they have a dedicated SOC. They love the attack framework, but they haven't been using it and really need a place to start. They want to run the assessment, but they understand the limitations, which is one of the key elements for whether or not you should run an attack-based SOC assessment. And then when it comes to detection, they're only doing a handful of things that are really important for us in this example. I know most SOCs are doing many things, but in this example, we're just looking at 2 endpoint detection tools, and then some custom analytics that they have running in a network perimeter, detection tool that they built on their own. And to give an example of what it looks like to run through an assessment, here's a a notional tool we're calling Substantive Defender. And during an attack-based SOC assessment, you often have to look at each of these components, tool A, tool B, tool C, and come up with heat maps of them individually. And this is something that can be a bit challenging when you're doing it with a pen and paper, because you're not executing no joke in the environment to figure out what worked and what didn't work. And so in this example, we have this tool Substantive Defender. And if we're coming in and doing an assessment, sometimes all we'll get for the tool, especially if we've never heard of it, is just some marketing material. And the MAD material walks through how to do this in more detail. But looking at this very short description, I'm not going to read through it, but I'm just going to highlight a few key phrases that stick out to me. Number one, endpoint detection and response. That's implying that SD, Substantive Defender, is running on the endpoint. It's looking at adversary behaviors, which is a great thing. It's trying to be a little bit more dynamic. And then what it's looking at, okay, it's diving into process events and network events. This is all very good, good things, but it's not particularly specific. And to try to get more specifics, we can talk to the SOC and go for some interview results. And here we might find that the SOC says that they have little control of their endpoints, but SD is deployed on most of them. And that's a great thing, because it means that whatever coverage is afforded by this tool, that is going to be kind of throughout the SOC on most of the endpoints. They also say that their red team's biggest obstacle is this Substantive Defender tool. Whenever it fires an alert, they always act on it. Another great positive here. They do say, however, that they lack a good SIEM capability, so they can't use all of SD's telemetry features. There's not much we can do with this information, given how little information we have about the tool, but it's good to know. And lastly, they rarely detect discovery. Now, all of this taken together is definitely some good stuff. It seems like this is a good tool, and it's got a lot of positives to it. Having said that, that's not very specific. We want to come up with a heat map showing what coverage looks like for the tool. And if we just show it at the tactical level, within the attack framework, that's definitely okay when you have to do it, but it's not. It's definitely not the specificity we'd like. And to get more specific, one of the things we like to do in assessments is go out and find prior analysis and prior results from looking at these tools hands-on. And one of the first places we like to look are the attack evaluations project. And for that and more info on that project, I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Yeah, I'm Frank Duff, the general manager for the attack evaluations program. And attack evaluations really do come to what Andy was talking about there, where it is trying to get to the brass tacks of coverage, right? How do these tools actually perform under the stressors of a real adversary? A lot of the times when we talk about attack, it comes down to specific patterns of activity and the realism of the procedures. It's one thing to theoretically have coverage, it's another thing to actually have coverage. And so out comes attack evaluations to highlight some of that attack coverage with more certainty. So what we are vendor paid evaluations. Vendors come in, they choose to participate in these evaluations. They are historically focused on the detection aspects, so attack-based detection. So once an adversary is in your environment, how do you detect them? How do you identify their malicious behavior? This last round, we did add in protections for the first time. So trying to stop specific attack activity. Again, still focused on that post-exploit behavior. We do not score, we do not rank, we do not rate vendors, and more on that later. But we just try to say this is what tools can do. And leave it at that. Why do we do this? For first and foremost, to the points of the SOC assessment, it's one thing to hear from a vendor what they think that their coverage is. It's another thing to do a theoretical assessment. It's another thing to talk about the true capabilities of a product. And so when we run our evaluations, we're using real humans to perform the evaluation so that we can understand how these perform under real adversary behavior. And we also do this to drive the vendor community forward, both by working with the vendors themselves and improving their standalone capabilities, but also by working with the vendors and publishing the results so that the entire community can understand the state of attack detection and protection and understand how they could perhaps improve themselves. So where can you find this information? It is available on the Attack Eval's website, listed there. You will find deep technical results that I'll showcase in a little bit here. We do release our methodologies. So our emulation plans that we use to perform these attack evaluations, you can find those. as well as tools to analyze the results data. And we'll walk through different components of this as we go forward here. Next slide. So the genesis of attack evaluations really comes down to everybody wants to understand attack coverage, but attack is huge and it's only growing. Right now we've got sub-techniques in addition to techniques, which just compound the problem. Additionally, each of those techniques can be done in a number of different ways, which get to the procedural level variations, how specifically attack is executed. So because attack is huge, you need to start somewhere. And so what better place to start than the threat? Rather than focus on the hypothetical or things in a vacuum, let's actually identify a threat that would be interesting to us and perform an evaluation based on that threat. That way you get that end-to-end execution. You get to see everything from that initial execution through the end goal, whether that be exfiltration or data encryption. And you also get the technique variation, right? Every one of these actors performs things in a slightly different way, right? Some will use PowerShell, some will use a command shell, some will directly access APIs. You get that technique variation through performing various adversary emulations. The key thing here is the emulation is inspired by. It's not supposed to be a direct one-to-one mapping to the adversary. It's not about using their tool set. It's about replicating their behaviors. We base everything on openly available threat intel, just as attack does. We process, we look at the reverse engineers of the malware. We try to understand how techniques were implemented, what the really objectives were from the adversary, and then we try to replicate it to the best of our abilities. In some cases, we might need to update the procedures. For instance, let's say the adversary had been known to use a specific bypass UAC, but that bypass UAC is no longer available on the current Windows. Well, we might need to update to a more refreshed version so that we can actually implement that behavior. And we might need to fill in holes where we need to, just because there's intel gaps. But it's an inspired by emulation based on threat intel. And by looking at what adversaries have done in the past, we can better ensure that we can detect those. And once we get our hands around those, eventually we'll be able to look about the future. But let's start with that past. And another key thing here is we do not focus on the IOCs. Again, this isn't about understanding how well your AV works. This is really about understanding the underlying behavior so that you can have the most robust defenses. Next slide. So what's the attack evaluation process? I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail. You can find more information on our site. But we do have that first part, which is a big portion of the work that we do, which is defining an accurate threat emulation. And so we have to research the threat. We create their emulation plan by putting things together into logical sequencing, filling in those holes, and developing a plan that at the end of the day will be executed by a human so that we can control certain aspects of it. However, it's going to be something that we can literally copy and paste for every evaluation. So we can ensure, for instance, this last round where we had 29 participants, that all 29 participants are getting the exact same methodology. They're being evaluated with the exact same cadence of the commands that are being executed. So it's a very scripted activity, although human implemented script. We then have the execution phase, which is running the attack evaluations and collecting the data. In this phase, we provide vendors all access to a common range. They deploy their solution, they configure the solution, and then we perform an evaluation together. It's built to be collaborative. And so we tell them what we do and how we do it, and we run the evaluation and collect data. Finally, there's a release process, which revolves around a lot of review process on our part to ensure that we're appropriately articulating what a single capability is, but also then looking across all the participants to ensure that we're talking about them in the same way in a fair and consistent manner. Vendors have a chance to provide a review, and then we finally publish the results. And that publication is what you see on the attack evaluations website. Oftentimes people will ping me and ask, well, where can I get the report? There is no additional report. We outline a bunch of data on our site and then tools to be able to leverage that data. And part of this process is an abstraction. So when we do the processing of the results, right, we have a bunch of raw data that we have to consider. But the problem is when you talk about 29 different tools, they all interpret their information in slightly different ways. So we do abstract this to what we call detection categories, which relate to the amount of context that they're providing an end user. For instance, did alert talk about things about how a specific technique was executed? Well, then they get a technique. Do they talk about the high level goals that the adversary was trying to achieve? Well, then that gets a tactic level. And those correlate with the purpose of tactic and technique from attack. We also have a general, which is just general, hey, this behavior was suspicious or malicious, and so it was flagged by the tool. At the core, we have telemetry, which just provides the visibility. Next slide. So result limitations. So this goes to the point that attack evaluations aren't the end all that be all for understanding what a true capability could do. These are done in a very select environment, built specifically to ensure that we've got a baseline understanding of a tool's potential performance. So it's collaborative. In this case, the vendor's providing the blue team, and the red is, and MITRE is providing the red team. What that's doing is that we're helping the vendor along the way to identify the right behavior. So we are right there from a red team perspective. How in a real world, you won't have an adversary telling you what they did. In our world, we do. And to that degree, it is open book. We tell them exactly what we did, how we did it, where we did it, what users we used, what processes we used. If they have questions on specific red team tool sets that we're using, we're open book. We're telling them everything that we can to help ensure that their detections are flagging on the right behavior. And finally, it's a baseline performance. It's a small environment, 5 to 10 nodes, combination of workstations and servers. There are no users except for if, for instance, we need to emulate key logging, we'll log into a machine and implement that, but there's no synthetic noise generated by users in this environment. So for things like false positives, we don't provide visibility there. What we do provide is, again, that baseline understanding of what a tool's potential capability could perform. And for more information about how now to leverage SOC assessments and attack evaluations and how those come together, I'm going to bounce it back to Andy.
Thanks, Frank. So tying it back to assessments, we're going to walk through an example now, looking again at substantive defender. And before we get into that example, there are some gotchas or caveats. We always want to make sure that if folks do this on their own or do this at home, they're really armed with all the tools they need to do it in a way that's the most accurate. The first thing that we note is that evals results only cover the tested techniques. This is going to be a subset of the matrix based on the specific adversary profile being tested. In a SOC assessment, you might want to consider the entirety of the framework itself. Evals also only look at specific procedures, kind of tying it back to that adversary emulation plan. Because a tool can detect one instance of a technique doesn't mean it'll always detect all of them. So there's a little bit of alignment question there. And then evals results, they sometimes use different categories across rounds. APT&CK-based versus the recently released like Carbon-ACK results. Those are just a little bit different in how they're described, but they do largely stick to the same format. And lastly, evals only test the tools in specific lab scenarios. The big thing is that your deployment or the SOC's deployment will almost always vary. So you should always consider that when you're incorporating results. With that said, here is a kind of notional heat map for substantive defender, kind of categorizing each technique based on the overall detection category from this notional evals scenario that we've created. Here we have, in red or in white, techniques that are not applicable for this round. In red, techniques where substantive defender didn't get anything on. In orange, anything it got telemetry for. In kind of lime green, anything I got kind of general detection, tactic and technique kind of increasing in the green scale. And one of the questions you'd ask is if you want to use this as part of your assessment, well, I have this idea of, let's say like low, some, and high confidence. How do I map what evals is scoring by over to what the attack assessment is trying to use? And what we can do here is just a very simple mapping of, let's just say, anything that's not applicable, none, or telemetry, let's just call that low confidence. Anything that's general detection, maybe some confidence, and then tactic or technique, let's call that high confidence. And that seems to make sense at kind of face value. But, and again, before continuing on, I want to make sure that everybody's fully armed with all the knowledge. this mapping of these detection categories to confidence levels, it's not a perfect one-to-one. This is more or less a place to start. It's not necessarily like, yep, that's how you do it. Really in practice, the detection categories don't always align particularly well with confidence levels. In this very toy scenario, it lines up reasonably well, but you always want to be on the lookout to make sure you're not oversimplifying the results from evals because they're so in depth. And with that said, we'll go with this kind of low sum and high mapping. And when you do that, you can see kind of the color scheme changes. And now this is familiar to what we originally proposed in that kind of first slide that we kicked it off with. Now this makes sense, again, at face value, but in practice, it's not entirely accurate. And the reason is because, well, we also have these interview results, which say how the new path SOC is using Substantive Defender. And if you go through these, you'll find, well, number 2, here they say that their red team's biggest obstacle is this specific tool. And they have so much confidence in the tool that when it fires an alert, they always act. What that says to me is that, yes, let's look at the legend down in the lower right-hand side and say, well, this makes sense, but that general alert, you know what? Maybe that should actually be treated as high confidence of detection because this statement from the SOC is so, for lack of a better term, powerful as to how they're using that tool. So we can maybe kind of change the mapping that way. And the second thing that sticks out is this last one, number 4. We rarely detect discovery. This is a great case where, yes, the tool on paper should be able to detect these kind of 5 discovery techniques that are listed, but in practice, the SOC isn't using it to do so. That's why they're saying they rarely detect it that way. And with that in mind, we can then kind of change the discovery mapping, and we get this final heat map that starts with those attack evals results, comes up with a mapping to our attack-based SOC assessment, rubric or schema, and then we incorporate the interview results, and we get this as kind of a decent representation of what the tool might cover. Now, one thing I note here is that, in our description of the tool, it was a very, it certainly seemed like a very powerful tool, but because we're using the evals results, we're really only talking about the techniques that were tested in evals. So if you're doing this in practice, you might want to kind of maybe even draw some inference or at least put on paper and tell the SOC, like, yes, this is only what was covered in evals. Coverage of techniques that weren't covered in those evals results, that might actually be a little bit stronger than what we're listing here. Now, going to the next step, what we do is we want to create overall coverage for the SOC. And really to do that, we're just going to kind of combine everything. Here, again, it's going to be way too small to read. We're going to take that heat map for Substantive Defender. We're going to add in the results from looking at their analytics. We're going to add in the results from looking at this other tool they're running. And then we're going to bring in the interview results. And when you bring all that together, you get this as the final coverage, heat map for a new path. And this is great. And, most SOCs, they love to get this, but at face value, there's not a whole lot you can do with a heat map without actually, doing something with the heat map, right? The heat map is only as valuable as what you do with it. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but one of the things we always say is whenever you do an attack-based SOC assessment, it's always very important for you to follow it up with recommendations to help the SOC improve. And, or rather to learn more about all of these different areas, I'd refer you over to the MITRE Attack Defender content. But to give a little taste or a few examples, I'm going to first talk about, say, technique prioritization. This is one of my favorite recommendations where it's often, daunting, or rather in some cases it's daunting to say, hey, I'm doing my security operations. I think I'm doing a great job. And then you go in, you come up with a heat map and you find out, oh boy, I got a lot of gaps here and I don't know what to do. And one of the things we like to recommend to kind of, move past this is to say, okay, yes, there are gaps and these are on paper, but this is a starting spot for you. And to get better, instead of just saying, well, I've got tons of gaps, I don't know what to do, you can start focusing on a smaller set of techniques that, really help you start reorienting what you're doing towards the attack framework. And in this example, I've gone through and put in blue a bunch of techniques that new path had low confidence of detection for detecting and kind of had a variety of reasons, and walking through them, these 3 techniques, external remote services, indicator removal from host, and data from local system, we might recommend those because, say, they're used by APT&CK-29, who is a relevant threat actor. We also recommend ingress tool transfer as a technique for the SOC to focus on. And this one might be because, say, that they have the right data, the right logs, so that they can actually build an analytic to detect it. These three we'd recommend because, let's just say in this example, we've had new paths saying, yep, we've seen these before. The red team executes them all the time, and these are definite gaps for us. One of the ideas being that, well, if the red team is using these, maybe we can get a little bit of a purple team process going on to help, try to increase our ability to detect them. And then lastly, we might just recommend, okay, focus on this small set of discovery techniques just to get your foot in the door to start detecting discovery, because it is a big gap for your SOC. And these four are, by some sort of, numeric measure or categorical measure, we'll just say that they're popular and they're good places to start. Now, recommending techniques is great, and I think it's a key component of a good attack-based SOC assessment. But we also like to recommend ways for SOCs to improve their coverage. And there's 4 big buckets of ways you do this. And again, I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but the high level is you can tell the SOC, you know what, you should start ingesting more data sources and building more analytics. This is a great way to just kind of piecemeal, start increasing your overall coverage, implementing mitigations, moving past detection, or maybe just not doing detection and instead doing prevention, trying to prevent certain techniques that you might have gaps, prevent them from being executed. And of course, the last one, adding new tools, taking your environment and saying, okay, I'm going to bring something off the shelf, throw it in there, and I'm just going to, totally change what my detection surface looks like. And so to tie it back to our theme of, let's look at both assessments and evals. Well, let's talk about, ingesting data sources and building analytics in the context of substantive defender. Going back to the results we had for looking at this tool, you can see a lot of these things, they're actually, or a lot of the techniques in the assessment, they're in orange. This tool is able to collect the right telemetry to potentially allow you to build analytics to detect these techniques. And with that in mind, you might say, okay, I'm going to revise my mapping over here so that telemetry, instead of that being low confidence of detection, maybe that should be some confidence of detection, because maybe I can build an analytic for that. And when you do that, you get a much different picture for what the coverage of this tool does. And when you bring it back to the overall coverage of the new path SOC, you can see that there's a lot of improvements that you would make, a lot of things that went from low confidence to some confidence just because you're collecting telemetry. And in particular, these new ones in purple, if you're looking at this slide, these 4 techniques show up as those, being prioritized based on our technique prioritization plan, but also being now potentially detectable provided you reconfigure the substantive defender tool. And so at face value, this makes a lot of sense. And it's a great way to use the eval's results, provided you do get a little bit of that, telemetry information, and also on how the SOC is using the tool. In this example, though, it's not entirely perfect, because when we tie it back to the interview results, we get to point number 3, which says that, oh, well, it turns out that they lack a good SIEM capability, so they can't actually use all of SD's telemetry features. So in order for them to really make the full use of this tool, they need to first invest in or deploy some kind of SIEM capability so that they can actually use the telemetry for useful detections. Now, from here, you can, of course, say, okay, this SOC, you guys should, build these analytics, reconfigure how you're using SD. And to do that, you first need to require a SIEM capability. And that's definitely a solid recommendation, but it's certainly a bit of a process, right? To have to build in that new acquisition and then also engineer it and then roll out like an analytic development capability. So with that in mind, we can go back to the drawing board and thinking about SD and that lack of a SIEM capability. These first 2 options, they don't seem all that great for this new path SOC. It's going to be an uphill battle, to say the least, to really ingest more data sources or add new analytics. This third capability, or the third recommendation of, hey, you guys should implement some mitigations, definitely makes sense, but we can go back to the interview results again and specifically focus on point number 1 there that says, well, turns out we don't have a lot of control of our endpoints. That's going to make it very difficult for them to deploy a lot more mitigations. Certainly not impossible, but again, get into a little bit of that uphill battle category. And with that, we'd say, okay, maybe that's not the exact right way to go. And so having said all that, by process of elimination, it seems that, one of the last things we should look at or consider, going as our primary recommendation is for them to add new tools. And this makes a lot of sense, but, it's hard for us to say, well, what tool do I add, right? There's a large plethora of different tools that could potentially help a SOC. And when you pick from all of them, you have a big decision to make, to put it nicely. And so a lot of folks, and myself in particular, I might look at this and say, well, let's just choose the best tool, right? Let's just choose whatever is the best, throw it in there. And tying it back to evals, you might say, well, let's look at the attack evals project, find the best tool, and then recommend that one. And before going any further, I'm going to hand it over to Frank to see what he thinks of that recommendation.
It's a wonderful question, right? And it's the one that so many people have. And every year around result release, we are inundated by vendors all claiming what they did great, and a bunch of end users who are dreading the incoming list of webinars that are coming at them. I think that the important thing to remember is, one, attack evaluations does not decide who wins. All we do is say what each capability can do. But one of the unique things about that is it's often beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or imagination it drives what is winning in a lot of these cases. I think that it's important to remember that every vendor is coming in here, they're already embracing attack for the most part. They are using it to define their technical roadmaps. They're integrating it into their products. They are attack believers. And so when they come into an attack evaluation, the hope would be that they generally do pretty well, right? They have to be able to articulate their behaviors based on attack. They've known which adversary is coming for months. They're coming in with an idea that they are going to do well, and hopefully that is true. And we want vendors to be able to come out of this feeling like they did do well, and they each did their things unique. But the important part is trying to understand what is unique, or what is the best for your specific situation. To Andy's point, there isn't a overarching winner. If we could define a winner that easily, we would, but instead it comes down to so much nuance. So what we try to do then, if you advance the slide there, Andy, we try to provide a bunch of data and results to make it possible for you to be able to determine which is right for you. So new this round, we have this evaluation summary page. So when you go into the attack evaluations website, you can search for any of the previous participants. In this case, we've selected one that's participated in the ATT&CK and the Carbanak Fin7 emulations. And then build, please. All right, and so you can select which specific rounds you want to look at, and then you could dive into those specific results. So in this case, you could dive into the ATT&CK results or the Carbanak Fin7. As I mentioned before, and just to refresh here, every round we focus on different adversaries. So the first evaluations we did back in 2018 were done with APT3, who's associated with China, and APT-29 the following year associated with Russia. And then Carbanak and Fin7, two groups that both leverage the Carbanak malware. We did this last year and released them in April. So the 2020 is when it was executed. And we've just recently announced the call for participation for the Wizard, Spider, and Sandworm evaluations, where the call for participation actually closes at the end of this week. So vendors are signing up for that as we speak. But right here, you've got the overview of general overarching performance. Now we've came to the realization after the APT-29 results were released that we can't just release results and leave it to the community to make sense of it. And so what we're trying to do is start making ways that we can slice and dice the data to provide better insights into what lies underneath. So before you dive into the deep results and understand all the detections and read the detection notes that we'll show shortly, right here, you can provide some high-level understanding of the performance of a tool. Build ones. So we've created some statistics. These aren't the end-all be-all of statistics. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and by no means are we saying that there's one that has to stand out here. Another thing to note is to say that higher isn't necessarily better. It all depends on your specific use cases, your specific needs to do, right? A lot of detections might be a bad thing. It could be alert fatigue if a vendor's not presenting the information good or well. Or maybe you've got a great SOC and you know how to triage, and so a lot of alerts could be helpful. And similarly, telemetry is great if you have an experienced SOC that wants to be building analytics like Andy talked about. But if your SOC is maybe a little bit more novice or just not as equipped to build their own analytics, then maybe you want better analytic coverage. It all comes with different tugs and pulls. And then one of the other unique metrics that we have here is visibility. So that's kind of the union of analytic and telemetry coverage. So in this case here, if you look at Carbonac and Fin7, they had some level of detection on 158 of our 174 substeps that we executed during the course of the test. And that equates to about 50-ish, 55-ish different techniques, I believe it was, for that round. So on average, we executed each about 3 times, so it's not linear like that. But of the 174 substeps, they had detections on 158. On 150 of those, they had telemetry. So where does the other 8 come from? Well, on 8 steps, they had an analytic of some kind, at least one, that provided that extra visibility, but they didn't have the raw telemetry available for the end users. So build once more. The important point here is even though attack evaluations releases metrics now, there is no golden one that provides you a clear-cut winner, right? At the end of the day, it all comes down to your use cases. Next slide. So here's an example of our actual detailed results that you can dive into. So let's say we clicked on APT29 and we dove into those results. You can scroll through the entire scenario that we run, which is 20 steps, which equates to that 160-ish sub-steps that we were previously talking about or seen in the previous slide. But you can bring up their specific results. You can see their detections. You can see the actual screenshots from the platform that showed how that data would be represented. And so what this is meant to do is not just give you an idea of, did they detect it, yes or no? It's supposed to be how they detected it. Is that going to be right for your SOC? Is that going to be right for your analyst? Does that meet their level of expertise and understanding of how the data is going? Is that going to fit your general use case as you triage information? So we try to provide as much information as possible that users can go and then build off of. So in this case, we've got some additional information that's available to us, right? We've got not just the step and the technique and the tactic and which detections they had and a little note that describes it, but we also have the procedural information. We have the detection criteria saying that, okay, for this specific technique that's highlighted, which was software discovery, security software discovery, we would say that you had to have a PowerShell event that shows that it executed the get WMI object query. And that specifically looks for antivirus products. And so in this case, they had that technique alert. This is what the technique alert looked like in the screenshot. And from this, you should be able to get a better idea of not just whether they had that discovery that Andy was looking for, but would this be the right discovery mechanism for you, right? Is it the right amount of granularity? Is it going to be helpful for the analyst to see and understand? Next slide. And so we recognized again that providing a bunch of results to people and making them read through it was a big ask. And so what we've tried to do is also give you the tools so that you can start analyzing the results yourself. We don't want to create one universal way of comparing the participants, but we do want to enable you to compare the participants. And so there are a couple tools that we have. The first one that's listed and not shown here is the technique comparison tool. When Andy was talking about developing analytics for specific techniques, that can be a great resource. So for all of you that are actually going off and building out analytics, I urge you to look at that tool. What that allows you to do is select a specific technique under test from any of our evaluations that we've done, and then select the participants that you're interested in doing. So let's say you are a user of one of the tools, you could select that one, or you could select a bunch of its competitors, and you can bring up the results and understand how each of them performs that detection. And by reading the notes, you get some ideas of maybe that's a detection I could write and I could build out my analytic coverage. So it does help a little bit with that. But for the sake of the question that Andy had posed to me of which tool is better for him, he should probably be looking at the participant comparison tool, which I've shown here. What this allows you to do is select different vendors that participate in the evaluations, 2 at a time. You select the 2, and it shows the differences. Build, or next slide. Yeah. So we do have a walkthrough for what it's worth, and this is actually a screenshot of the walkthrough so that I could not choose specific vendors because I don't like showing favorites during these things. But you can walk through a tour and see how this exactly works. But for simplicity reasons, right, in this case, there's 2 different vendors, vendor A and vendor B. The first line, 1A1, shows black. That means that they got the same category of detections. So whether they got both telemetries or telemetries and techniques, in either case, they got the same. So we're roughly saying that they've got same capability, more or less. But then 1A2, we've highlighted purple, and that's to denote that there's actually a difference. And so this tool actually was built because one of our end users that was giving us feedback was like, hey, I had to look at all your results from 2 different vendors. I opened up 2 windows and I scrolled through them and tried to figure out what is the diff between them. So we're like, you know what, that could be a lot easier. Let's build out the tool to do it. And so this is what it is. And so it shows on this one that in this specific case, it's not particularly interesting, but the telemetry and telemetry correlated are 2 different things. And this goes to a detection category that we had called correlated in previous rounds that showed the connection between different data elements. But you can do this for any of the rounds. You pick the round, you pick the steps that you want to look at. You can filter by specific tactics you want to look at. But you can scroll through the results and easily identify where there's differences and be able to do a side-by-side comparison of 2 tools you're considering. And so we found that this is a very powerful tool that people can use to get at the data easily. And for what it's worth, even in these, you can still click in this case, the telemetry or telemetry correlated or any of the techniques, and you get the actual details for that detection as well here. So it provides, again, allows you to dive into it, and it goes as deep as you really want to go to fully understand what the detection is. And with that, I think that we can hand it back off to Andy.
Thanks, Frank. So unfortunately, I don't have a good use case to show through with the side-by-side tools, but we're going to dive back into NewPath and talk about like how we can use the results to customize the recommendation of which tool to recommend for them. Before doing that, though, a couple of caveats and general guide points when you're looking at recommending a tool from eval results. Number 1, always consider the results in the context of the assessment. You always want to look at those eval results and think about how they will change the coverage of the SOC you're looking at. And a great example, which we'll walk through, is if a SOC has particular strengths, you don't necessarily want to acquire a new tool that, well, it already solves those strengths, right? You want to remediate those gaps. The second thing is that a tool is only as strong as the people using it. If a tool is hard to use or it has engineering hurdles or just the folks in the SOC that you're working with, they generally say, no, I don't want that tool, then it won't necessarily always achieve its potential. Really, it depends on the people and what they think would be good too. Budget matters. It's always important to weigh the differences in technique coverage and how it changes coverage in the context of both personnel preference, right, as well as cost, right? You always want to think about cost when you're recommending things to a SOC. If you had infinite money, maybe you'd do things a little bit differently, but in reality, we often do have to deal with budgets. And lastly, don't feel like you have to force it. If none of the tools in the evals project are perfect or right for the SOC, you don't need to recommend one of them, right? There isn't saying, okay, we have to do this. It's more of this could help you as you're coming up with recommendations and finding tools that would be good to recommend for the SOC you're working with. So diving back into NewPath, we know we want to recommend a tool for them. And here we're going to walk through a hypothetical scenario where they're looking at 2 tools that are in the evals project. One of them is here, it's called Hollow Scanner. This is a kind of very fictitious notional chart showing this tool's results from like an APT-29 assessment. There is a little bit of fudging on the legend where we're oversimplifying things, kind of similar to before. But again, it's a heat map and a nice starting spot. Here's the other tool. We're going to call it Unscrambler. It's similar but a little bit different, and we can do on our own is kind of come up with a little bit of a side by side where when we take the 2 tools and we count, okay, here's the number of techniques for none, telemetry, general, tactic, and technique. Count those for each tool and then compare them. Well, when you look at it, Unscrambler seems much better, right? Holoscanner has 10 techniques it provides no coverage of, as opposed to Unscrambler, which provides no coverage of only 4 techniques. Telemetry in general, Unscrambler provides more. Technique, Unscrambler provides more. Tactic, there is a little bit more on Holoscanner, but overall that seems outweighed by Unscrambler. Now, at face value, you'd say, okay, I'm going to look at this, and Unscrambler definitely makes more sense. It looks like the better tool. But what we can do is say, well, no, not so fast. Like, how does this actually help NewPath, right? How would this tool change their current coverage? And what we can do is a very simple chart here, a simple table, where we're looking at general, tactic, and technique, and seeing what techniques do each of these two tools have strengths around, those 3 categories that they currently have either low or some confidence of detection of. And when you run those numbers, it actually seems a little more balanced. Holoscanner can potentially improve 19 low techniques versus Unscrambler's 18, a little bit better towards Holoscanner. And then Holoscanner can improve 3 of the some confidence of detection techniques versus the 5 for Unscrambler. It's a little bit better on the Unscrambler side. So it's not quite clear, but it's definitely not as clear cut as just the counting. Now, the second thing you can do is start looking at the prioritized techniques. And here's where things get a little bit more interesting, because you can compare the 2 side by side on each of these and find out that, hey, it looks like Holoscanner, it's got these, for masquerading, process discovering, and ingress tool transfer, Holoscanner is definitely better. But for data from local system, Unscrambler looks to be a little bit better. And when you count these up and compare them side by side, it actually looks like Holoscanner is the better tool. Even though its overall coverage didn't seem as high as Unscrambler, it wasn't as it certainly wasn't as clear cut as just counting up the individual techniques. So at this point, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. I've kind of walked through, kind of this notional example, and I feel bad because I've skipped a lot of stuff on how you'd run an attack-based SOC assessment. As I mentioned, we have this MITRE Attack Defender program where you can kind of go through and learn how to do much more with attack-based SOC assessments. But to talk about that more, I'm actually going to turn it over to Steve Luke.
Hi, thanks, Andy. Great briefing, guys. A lot of good information there. Obviously, this is a very complicated topic. Some of the takeaways from my perspective are, like if you were trying to buy a car, you might want some other entity to have tested a bunch of cars and done crash tests and figure out the mileage, safety ratings, torque, max speed, acceleration, all those kinds of things for you. So you don't have to go do that for every tool, empirically test them all. But, those companies that do those tests don't know you and your family and your needs for a car. Do you need a pickup truck? Do you need a little car to just get around the city? How many people do you have in your family? How big does the car need to be? Are you planning on going a lot of trips or not, right? So there's a lot of personalization that each individual knows about that these testing companies don't know, and they have to bring that to the table. And so I think there's sort of an analogous situation here where Frank, with the attack evals, you are empirically testing across a whole bunch of these tools and getting a lot of solid data on the tools, but you're not in the position to say, this is the best tool for you, because you don't know each individual situation, right? And Andy, you're bringing to that the SOC assessment piece where you are the SOC and or you're the consultant to the SOC, but you are understanding that particular SOC's strengths and prioritized needs. And so you've got that detailed information, and then you can leverage the attack evals results to incorporate that into your overall assessment. So I really see these two as like complementary pairs, right? The evals results themselves sort of stand alone as assessments of the tools, but they don't have that personalization to a given SOC. And then the SOC assessments are very personalized and tailored, and they have a lot of detailed information about the SOC. And they really benefit from having this empirical testing of the tools that evals is providing. So I think they go really well together. You know, as the slide is saying, I'm the director of MITRE Attack Defender. I've been working with Andy and Jamie and Adam and the other MAD professors to develop a curriculum around all of these topics. You know, what is attack and how do you use it, right? Because what we found is that a lot of people have heard of attack. I bet a lot of people in this webinar have heard of attack because you're here. And they, you know, in my experience, they look at it and they're like, wow, that's really cool. That's amazing, right? All this great information about what adversaries are actually doing. And it's being described at the level of TTPs, right? The top of David Bianco's pyramid of pain. These are things that don't change that frequently about how adversaries operate. They're the behaviors of the adversary, not the low-level IOCs like IP addresses and hashes of files. So it's really powerful to have that information. And I think everybody resonates with that. And what MAD is trying to do is then teach people not only what is attack, but then how do you use that information to do your actual job better, right? So the first few courses that we have, the first one is Attack Fundamentals, and that is just Attack 101. What is attack? What's involved? How do you read attack? What's in it? And what are some of the standard use cases for it? And then the next two courses that we have already published are Attack for Cyber Threat Intelligence and Attack SOC Assessment, which is what you've been hearing about today from Andy. And so they're teaching people, how do you take that knowledge of attack and use it to extract behavioral TTP kind of information out of narrative reporting or out of reverse engineering of malware? And then how do you use that information in your analysis? How do you share it with others? That's all in the Attack Cyber Threat Intelligence course. And then in the Attack SOC Assessment course, you'll learn all of these nuanced procedures that Andy was just talking about, with how do you look at a SOC and try to figure out what are they good at today and where do they need to improve and what's the best way for them to cover those gaps. So if you're in one of those jobs, you can come for free and take these courses. Watch the videos. They're short, like 10 minutes or less videos. They're hosted on Cybrary, and you can watch them for free forever. And you can learn about how to do all of those things. And go to the next slide, Andy. And so that's kind of the starting point for MAD. You go to the MAD Skills Hub at miter-ingenuity.org/MAD. That's the homepage. That's the single stop shop for all things MAD. You can get information about MAD, what it is, frequently asked questions, contact us, etc. But from there, you can also launch your learning journey. And so from there, you can then click Get Training. And Andy, if you progress, that moves you over to Cybrary's platform, where we have all of our videos hosted. And Cybrary pulls those together in a cohesive curriculum so that you start with the first video and you progress through them in a very logical way. And when you finish the videos, Cybrary will give you a certificate of completion. And you can use that to get continuing education credits. So you can sort of get credit right away just for watching the videos. But one of the things that I have found is that it's really easy to watch a video and sort of not really pay complete attention, or even if you do, not be sure that you really understand the content fully. And so what I have found personally is that if you have to take a test at the end, then you can really demonstrate to yourself, and nice, Chris. You can really demonstrate to yourself and to others that you actually understand the concept, the content and the concepts. So if you progress, Andy, to the next build there, that's why we recommend that you go ahead and subscribe to MAD. You come back to the MAD Skills Hub at miteringenuity.org, and you say get certified. And this is, kind of where you pay that $299. That's your annual subscription. And that gives you unlimited access to all of the assessments across all of the courses. Right now, we've got the 3 courses: Fundamentals, Attack for Cyber Threat Intelligence, and Attack for SOC Assessment. But we're coming out soon with Attack for Threat Emulation and Attack for Threat Hunting. And so that one $299 subscription will give you access to the certification exams for all of those things. You don't have to pay for each one, it's all included. And so then you will start the training, start the test, and if you progress, and once you pass that test, you'll get a badge that demonstrates, yes, you really understood that material. And one of the things that we used on the MAD team as our guiding principle for these tests is that we wanted to make the tests as realistic as possible. We want it to feel like you're doing the job of cyber threat intelligence or a SOC assessment or threat emulation or threat hunting. And we also wanted to feel like if you pass this test, we would feel comfortable bringing you onto our team. That we're not leaving something out of the test, that the test itself really does assess all of the important pieces of this content. And so you take a test, it gives you the badge if you pass. And if you get the right combination of badges, you get the associated certification. And those badges and certifications are things that you can use to know for yourself that you actually understand the content in a way that just watching the video might not do. But it's also something that you can share with others and demonstrate as a shorthand to them, yes, I understand this content in the way that MITRE wants me to. And I think that's powerful for communicating and building a community. And I also think that it will help raise the bar with training across the board, because there could be other ways that you learn this material. And if you can come in and pass this test, then you know that that was an effective way of learning that material. And if you didn't, then you know you have to go back and learn more. And so I think there's a lot of value in getting these badges and certifications. Now, the videos themselves, right now, you could watch all of the videos in about 4 hours. And that would go across all 3 of the existing courses. And the assessments, you might want to, if you took all of them, you might want to budget another 4 or 5 hours to take all of them. So that gives you a sense for this. Now we want to keep these certification exams alive, right? So as the threat landscape changes, as attack changes, as best practices change, we want to keep these things up to date so that if someone comes to you and says, I have the MAD certification, you know that it means they know the most recent stuff. So to answer Cliff's question there, it's exactly what I was getting to. Thank you, Cliff. I'm glad we practiced beforehand. Yes, sometimes the certifications will expire. It won't be based on a calendar thing. It's not like every year they expire. They will gray out if the content of that certification has changed significantly. So our guiding principle here is if we think that the content has changed so much that somebody with the old certification is not really demonstrating that they can do it the current way, that's when we're going to gray out the old certification and ask you to come recertify or rejuvenate your certification. So you'll never lose it. We're always going to keep the status that you have earned it, but it will just show up differently than the most recent version. So we've kind of gone through this a little bit already in that attack version 9 came out after we published the MAD certifications. And we decided that in that case, things had not changed enough to warrant graying out anybody's certification. So everybody's certification is still alive and well. We did update some of the material. We updated a video and we updated a few of the questions on the exams, but we just felt like if you could pass the exam before, you still basically understand how to do the job. So I'm not expecting these things to expire frequently or rapidly, but we do just want to make sure that they're keeping up to date. Okay, we did have one question that Frank and Andy, you might want to tackle here, which was about mapping technologies like DLP, IPS, EDR to the new attack data sources. What are your thoughts on how possible that is and what you need to do to make that happen?
So I'll take that first, and then Andy probably has a more official answer. And I'll be quick because I know we're getting to time. From an attack evaluations perspective, data sources provide a very unique visibility into the true capabilities of a product. For the first time this last round, we included data sources in our detection notes. So if you go to the Carbonac and Fin7 results, you can see what was the underlying data source. Unfortunately for us, attacks update hadn't really come out yet when we had started the evaluations. So we'll see how they continue to evolve and better map into attack. But I'm a big supporter of understanding what a capability is from a data source perspective. I will give a plug also to some of the work that Roberto Rodriguez, Cyber War Dog, has done in the past. It's always my go-to source for really understanding data sources, and his brother, as well as Jamie Williams from the attack evaluations team, did a wonderful post on the attack medium account that also goes into data sources and some of the philosophy that was there. So extra reading if you're interested.
Yeah, and so from an assessments perspective, and just before I get into it, because we are at time, I just want to make sure that URL was up there for MAD. From an assessments perspective, we actually in MAD have a whole chapter lecture called a lecture that talks about data sources. It is talking about the V8 version, but almost all of the ideas still apply to the new version of data sources. You know, it's definitely a step in.
Updated that video, Andy. That's the lesson that we updated.
Oh, there we go.
Data sources. Lesson 1.6.
So we have the update out there already. But, you know, looking at the data sources, it's nice because they're a lot more specific now. Whereas in the past, I know that there was always confusion over, you know, from a data source perspective, you know, antivirus, right, was a data source. But is it like, okay, I'm running antivirus, is that a data source? Or am I using antivirus? Is that a data source, right? And I think the new way data sources are being used makes it a lot more explicit as to how the data is being used. So I think it's going to be a much better kind of net positive when running attack-based SOC assessments.
That's great. I want to jump in here and thank everybody for attending today. Thank you to all of the panelists from the MITRE Ingenuity side of things. It's been really great for me to see how, you know, the MITRE ATT&CK framework gives us the framework. SOC assessments gives us that kind of deep dive into the SOC and where they're at. And I can leverage that with the evals tool to really see what tools might meet my needs, and that it's not really as simple as just picking the one that scores the best that Frank said we ought to use, that we really have to circle back around into that SOC assessment to find what works. And that's great, right? To know the why we're doing it and what it's really all about. But then it circles all the way back around here to the end, you know, as Steve is wrapping us up in the how do you go about doing that, and then the training both provided here at Cybrary and the assessments on the MITRE Ingenuity page to really pull it all together, I think is a really unique offering and a compelling offer in the space, and will make a huge impact on how SOCs in particular go to work accomplishing their mandate. I will say that as has been mentioned in the chat, the recording will be shared out along with the slide deck sometime next week. That will be available to everybody. And if there were any open questions that we didn't get around to, we'll definitely be sharing those amongst the team to try to get those addressed for you as well. Again, thanks to the MITRE Ingenuity team, and thanks so much to all those that attended today.
Thanks all.